the Rethinking European Development and Security speaker series. I want to alert you that we'll go until about 1:15, and because there are microphones placed across the table, side conversations will be picked up. So if you want to pass notes, that's probably safer than talking while our speaker is talking.
I don't think they can hear you back there.
Hashem, please stop.
We need to turn up the volume, I think.
Great. So it's my great pleasure, as I said, to welcome you to the first of the Rethinking European Development and Security speaker series, which is jointly sponsored by the European Center, the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, the Hoover Institution, and the Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Hilary Appel, who is the Podlich Family Professor of Government and the George Roberts Fellow at the Claremont McKenna College. She is the expert on the politics of economic reform in Russia and Eastern Europe, and has published several books and articles in leading scholarly journals. Her co-authored book with Mitchell Orenstein, From Triumph to Crisis, Neoliberal Economic Reform in Post-Communist Countries, won the Silver Medal Laura Shannon Prize for Best Book in European Studies. And so today we're delighted to welcome Professor Appel, and she'll speak on populism and the durability of the liberal order in Europe, EU and NATO enlargement reconsidered. Welcome.
Thank you so much for being here today. It's really a pleasure to be back at Stanford. And I have to say, I've been here since then, but I was a CREASE student here. I don't know if we have CREASE students here doing a master's in, I want to say it was Soviet studies, but by the time I finished the program, there was no more Soviet Union. And so I think they changed the title of the degree halfway through. But it's really kind of special to be back here 30 years later and to have this opportunity to talk about some of my research. This paper that I'm going to talk about today is part of a group project, in fact, organized by John Eikenberry and Peter Trubowitz, who have a project on thinking about the 1990s. So if you know John Eikenberry's work on the Bretton Woods institutions, he was looking at this critical juncture in history where you think about whether or not the liberal order or the global order is sort of set on a particular trajectory. And so it's a return to these ideas, but looking in the post-Cold War period, the decade following the end of the Cold War, whether or not the policy of the United States and of European leaders toward Eastern Europe was wise, whether these were good choices, and whether or not they advanced the liberal order for time to come. And I say that it's a project with a lot of different scholars with different regional expertise. Somebody's looking at United States policy toward China, and does that explain what we did in the 1990s, our relationship today? Another looking at Japan, another looking at Russia. I was asked to talk about Eastern Europe. And so for me, it was an opportunity to return to a decade that I spent a lot of time working on in different projects over the years. But of course, these questions are all the more pressing right now. The invasion of Ukraine has brought to the fore the question of NATO enlargement, whether this was a wise decision, whether this was provocative, whether this could be reasonably seen as a threat. And of course, the idea of EU enlargement has become quite topical with considerations of pathways to membership in Southern Europe, the Balkans, but Ukraine as well. So thinking about not just the decision to enlarge NATO in Europe, the European Union, but also the particular way in which it was carried out might give us some clues about what's happening today in Eastern Europe in terms of the survival or the consolidation of a liberal order. So this is part of that project. This is a chapter, and it does, in fact, quite nicely fit into what I think are the main themes of the REDS seminar of threats to Europe from the Eastern flank. And I thought, well, this grabs a lot of them. So I'm really pleased to be able to share this research with you and to get your feedback on some of the ways that this should be thought about. So so this project on the critical junctures for me is really focused on Eastern Europe. And so some of the questions that I'm asking is, did the specific form of EU and NATO accession, and specifically employing very strong conditionality, membership conditionality, and the creation of dependent market economies later cause the backlash? Also, are there linkages between accession and the rise of populists and the liberal leaders in Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere? And then finally, the paper looks at whether or not the 22 invasion of Ukraine, how that impacts the liberal trends in Eastern Europe, and does it further undermine the liberal order, or does it strengthen it? And I know that's been a theme in this seminar already. So thinking about the form of EU and NATO accession, well, the reason it seems like it could be linked to what's going on today in the rise of populism, authoritarian leaders, authoritarian institutional changes, things that are happening, is relevant because a lot of the language against the European Union and that Eurosceptic language originates in those early years of giving up policymaking authority to Brussels as part of the EU accession negotiation process. So there are these rhetorical linkages, certainly, between EU and NATO enlargement, well, I'll get to NATO in a minute, between EU enlargement and the Euroscepticism in East Central Europe today. The cases that this paper covers are Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Now, these cases are actually quite surprising if you're trying to put yourself back in the 1990s, because these were at the forefront of the accession process, the forefront of liberal political and economic transformations. And in fact, it's so surprising. Certainly no one would have thought 30 years ago, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, that they would be the forefront of the undermining of the liberal order in East Central Europe, in Europe broadly, and also part of a global trend toward autocracy. So in that sense, there are these surprising cases. They were the first to join in the first round in the European Union. NATO was also the first round in 1999, although Slovakia was later in 2004. They joined the Council of Europe, they joined the WTO in the 90s. So they were at the forefront of liberal transformation. And it seemed like everything was pointing in that direction anyway. There nonetheless was a decision by Western leaders to open up the process, to make them at least de jure full members of these multilateral organizations. But to do that, they had to basically give up policy autonomy and cede control to the European Union, to the European Commission, and adopt famously 80,000 pages of the acquis. So the kinds of institutions that are put in place are not a result of sort of struggles in the democratic process or stakeholders, putting their claims to certain ideas, but very much legislatures rubber stamping law after law after law in order to become harmonized with existing EU law. And now I imagine most people in this room understand that this process was invasive, it was intrusive. Some see it as even coercive, but the reality was that there was a widespread consensus in politics that this was the overriding priority. So it wasn't so much that these were imposed upon unwilling states, quite the contrary. There was a consensus in the political environment that this was the priority. And as you know, Grzymala-Busse in his paper talks about, in fact, that's what different kinds of actors were competing on, who could be faster, who could be more effective in carrying out these reforms, but not whether the goal itself of membership was at stake. So in truth, if we look back in the 90s, there was a lot of domestic enthusiasm for accession. And I would look back at the 90s as saying this was a period of great insight, foresight, vision about what Europe could look like going forward if you incorporate them not as at least de jure secondary members, but de jure primary equal members in multilateral organizations. So the EU accession process, unlike NATO, was very prescriptive and very invasive. But because of this broad domestic consensus and around this overarching priority, I would say that it helped bring momentum to forces already underway. Now, that doesn't mean that there was not local resistance, concentrated local resistance sometimes to particular requirements. And the accession process, the goal of membership helped people overcome those specific barriers. So, for example, it's very unlikely that Poland would have allowed German investors to get access to its land without this being an absolute condition of membership, or they would not have been able to privatize the steel industry in Slovakia and the Czech Republic had they not made the sale of these industries contingent upon closing the competition chapter. And even though politically it was a very difficult thing to do, they understood in a credible, real way when leaders said, if we do not do this, we are not going to be able to join the European Union, certainly not in this round, maybe not indefinitely. Another example by Kelly's work talking about how this very strict requirement of the European Union to give language rights to ethnic Russians in the Baltic states helped them overcome a lot of meaningful resistance to different kinds of language rights in those countries. But everyone understood that if they did not give these political rights to these minority groups, they could not join the European Union. So there's lots of examples for those of us who've studied these processes where even if there was a lot of groundswell momentum for accession, the very credible criteria that were out there that you need to close these chapters, these 31 chapters of accession, and you need to overcome this domestic political resistance or else mattered for political and economic liberalization across these countries. Okay. That said, it did mean you had to suppress a lot of political forces in society. The economic requirements did mean you had to institute often neoliberal economic reforms that were more neoliberal or more capitalist than you saw in the West European countries. You had to allow foreign investment to flow in the country. You had to, in order to gain access to markets, and this created what has been called in the field these dependent market economies. And yes, you could see how there might be linkages to the resentment toward foreign capital, toward the EU, as a result of the way it was carried out. In the very end, I'm going to return to why I don't find that to be a credible argument. In the end, I think these processes were extremely important for setting a trajectory of liberalization in these countries. And so unlike everybody else in the first couple of workshops for this project, I was the only one who was saying, this was good. These were good decisions. Everyone else is sort of natural academic, critical. Everything was wrong. Everything. I'm like, no, this required vision. This required sort of insight into what could be achieved by having a vision for the former communist countries and fully embracing them, fully welcoming them into Eastern Europe, into the European Union, excuse me. Let me turn to NATO though for a moment. NATO enlargement, of course, is something that we're paying a lot of attention to right now with the war in Ukraine, because this was, a so-called justification of Russia's sense of being threatened by multilateralism and the West. And so there's been a lot of consideration of whether this was such a great idea. Well, one thing I'll say is that there's actually been very little backlash to NATO enlargement even before this war. So EU enlargement, we know there's been Euroscepticism, there's been a lot of bashing of Brussels, but NATO hasn't really experienced that. And in truth, the way in which NATO accession occurred is part of that reason. NATO accession, unlike EU accession, happened earlier. It happened in a sense more quickly, but it was much less prescriptive. It did not require very intense scrutiny or bureaucratic monitoring, and it didn't even say how to organize your military. It did require countries to commit to certain spending floors, which were not enforced, but it did require contributions to NATO budgets. It did have certain obligations, but it was not very invasive. That said, the criteria, like for the European Union, did include political and economic liberalization. So it's kind of interesting when you think about what does this commitment to multilateralism, to joining, to opening up the EU and NATO to East European countries, the former communist countries. It was that commitment, first and foremost, to broad liberalization across areas that don't seem all that connected to issues of military security, at least not most directly. Philosophically, yes, but not that directly. So there was the broad membership criteria of political and economic liberalization. You need to have capitalism to be in NATO. But it was not invasive. It did not tell countries how to organize their militaries. And even though often they get put in the same basket, they're really quite different processes, in fact. And so we haven't seen much of a backlash. And if anything, with the war in Ukraine, I think there's been a renewed appreciation of the security guarantees that NATO provides. All right, so let's go back then to the European Union, where there has been this Eurosceptic backlash. So when does this start to emerge? If you think about it, we've been paying so much attention to Poland and Hungary, but it actually goes back earlier than that. And when I read some of the earlier speeches coming from Václav Klaus, who was the prime minister and then the president of the Czech Republic, a mainstay of Central European politics for well over a decade, I was surprised at how much they sounded like the kind of language that you hear from Orbán or Kaczynski, right? It's this idea that the European Union is an empire. And this Eurosceptic moment that came out of Václav Klaus was in between his embrace of free markets and his anti-environmental sort of phase he went through. But there was this period where he was very anti-EU, and he was the only leader, the only head of state to not endorse joining the EU. Every other head of state for all the accession countries endorsed it overwhelmingly. He did not endorse it. And he would say things like, Brussels is going to make the Czech Republic dissolve into the European Union like a cube of sugar. And we are not going to cede all of our authority to the European Union, which is nothing but an unelected group of elitist, bureaucratic, cosmopolitan. The language is actually very almost stereotypically populist. And the Euroscepticism is something that did not have any meaningful impact in my mind. So I was thinking about, why is it that it didn't catch on then? In large part because this is happening at a time where you do have the overwhelming consensus to gain membership in these organizations. And that membership that is described as coercive was indeed pretty powerful in making people choose priorities. But if you then look at what happens a decade and a half later, or maybe you should say the last decade is the way to think about it, the rhetoric coming out of Central Europe now, Poland, Hungary, and now very recently and quite significantly out of Slovakia, sound a lot like what Klaus was saying 15 years earlier. So Klaus is a sense, I thought he was an outlier, but he's actually somewhat ahead of his time in realizing that this could be a way to mobilize people, anti-European position. And then, so Orbán, though, takes it even a step further, though, of course, because he doesn't only sort of throw around Eurosceptic rhetoric, he also undertakes these kinds of anti-democratic institutional reforms that then set the process in motion for him to be subject to Article 7 proceedings. The same can be said for Poland, where we don't only have this kind of EU bashing, but we actually have some very significant violations of European norms and democratic institutions that then lead to Europe trying to react and trying to respond to those changes. And we know, I'm sure you all know, that it has not been effective, the Article 7 proceedings, because of collusion between Hungary and Poland, since it is a process requiring unanimity. So then they moved to the European budget, COVID relief funds. What could they do, at least up until the war, to try to motivate, inspire, incentivize, punish Polish and Hungarian leaders for anti-democratic or autocratic tendencies in those countries? All right. So then this question of this project was, is it a response? Is it a result of having a process that was so invasive and so precise and so specific during a session that's responsible for the backlash that then emerges later? So I don't think so. I don't think so. I think actually a lot was achieved during those years in terms of overcoming local resistance, domestic resistance to all sorts of programs, because of this trade-off, this very clear trade-off. Either you get membership or you get to exclude Russian speakers from ever gaining voting rights or language rights. And those trade-offs were very clear to people. What I would say is, though, that the Euroscepticism that emerges in these countries probably lies elsewhere. Now, there's different ways to do this, to sort of say, to try to discredit this case. But in the end, I think I was trying really hard to think about, well, then what is it that accounts for it? If we don't think that the 1990s, or that very important decade, determined the backlash that then follows as a result of the way it was carried out, in which these governments had no ability to voice their own concerns or try to adapt laws to their own domestic conditions in a way that was really true for the existing member states, right? They had opt-out clauses. But given they had no opt-out clauses, given that it was a kind of low-grade humiliation that they didn't have any authority over their own policy making, you know, is it something else that then better explains it, if that seems to me to be quite a superficial thing? Why do I think it's superficial? Well, first of all, the public opinion data on Europe, on approval of the EU, anything you can look at in Eurobarometer, Pew polling, YouGov, all those kinds of opportunities for data demonstrate that Euroscepticism doesn't really emerge until much later. So in terms of the norms, of European norms, values, and appreciation for those institutions, it's actually quite robust throughout this whole period when the coercive dimension of accession was strongest. All through that, there's no real popular basis, which is why Klaus doesn't get very far with his Euroscepticism. It doesn't do much for him because it doesn't resonate in society. This is a moment where there's such agreement over the direction of the country that he's not able to use those tools that seem so effective just a decade and a half later. If you look at Euroscepticism and polling data, it does really peak depending on which polls, but a lot of them look like it's happening after the financial crises and the migrant crises. It's not very connected to the way in which they were treated with this coercive or at least very intrusive membership process. So I think that's important to pay attention to. And then it's confusing because if you don't really get such strong data showing Euroscepticism, and you don't have any leave movements either, I should mention that, right? We don't have a Brexit version that's really mainstream in any significant way in these countries. You know, what's going on here? Why is this the case? Why should we be paying attention if these illiberal values don't run very deep? And I think I could turn to Ivan Krastev, who has this sort of interesting way of putting it. You know, East Europeans, this is a quote, are among the most pro-EU publics on the continent, and yet they vote for some of the most Eurosceptic governments. These governments in turn use Brussels as a rhetorical punching bag while benefiting from its financial largesse. So it seems like it's a rhetorical but not very deep sort of norm that is embraced. So let's I don't want to do that. All right, let me think, well, what do we care about? It's not enough to say these East Europeans are actually not illiberal in their hearts, right? There's something going on here because they keep electing Eurosceptic populist leaders. Orbán's on his 5th term, right? We'll see what happens in Poland this weekend. Slovakia now has just elected quite a populist. Well, Fico's been there a long time, but he's really been able to ride a certain kind of wave of Euroscepticism and populism. So what's going on here? Well, there are different explanations for the rise of Eurosceptic and populist leaders that don't seem all that connected to sort of deeply felt anti-liberal or anti-European norms, I would submit. There is obviously some portion of the population, maybe even you could think of a fringe portion of the population or the swing voters that matter so much that leaders are finding real value in appealing to those voters in gaining elected office. So that's part of it. There is certainly an element of that in society. So I don't want to say that that's the case, that it doesn't exist. In fact, maybe I should go back to the data. But the reality is that it's not. There is a overwhelming support for Europe, for liberal norms. They certainly are, relative to Western Europe, much more robust. But nonetheless, leaders are finding value in using this as part of their platforms. So I think we have to look at different things. I think, you know, we can look at the weakening of the left, the Social Democrats in Hungary in particular, how they were discredited due to a lot of fraudulent reporting of irresponsible economic policy in the aughts. We can look at the weakening of the center left elsewhere. We can also look at the fact that these leaders are able to get in power, in the case of Hungary, riding that frustration with the Social Democrats and change the electoral laws and change institutions that have a lasting effect that make it easier for them to be reelected later. Now, that's a very different thing than saying that the Hungarians are illiberal and it was just a matter of imposing a little bit of economic pain and they'll respond to it. There are actually very important institutional changes, as many of you know, that have allowed Fidesz, has allowed Orban to remain in office for so long. I think we would need to look at those electoral laws, at gerrymandering, some different things, in order to have a better understanding of why it is that these leaders keep getting reelected when the polling data show that the East Europeans are not more Eurosceptic than the West. I mean, relatively speaking, they're more Euro-embracing, they're greater Europhiles than you would see in many of the West European countries. So if we're going to be worried about Euroscepticism in Eastern Europe, well, then that's only requires us to be very worried about the project of the European Union in the major EU states as well. What I do think is really important, though, is the historical juncture. So this goes back to this idea that's motivating this project. Are there periods in history where the zeitgeist, where the spirit of the times, where the movement of norms, global norms even, could have some kind of impact? So I see the rise of Euroscepticism and populism in East Central Europe very much related to a global phenomenon, and not the path that they took, as tempting as it may be, toward these major organizations. And there's a couple of things that I would pay attention to that I think deserve unpacking. So first of all, the global context is that there are many powerful leaders around the world who provided a kind of demonstration of what happens to you if you flout these norms. They are part of a trend, and I think the trend matters because it's not so much that they necessarily want to emulate them, although you could make that case. I think it's more that you recognize that there was no real consequence for acting this way. And that's part of what made the 90s different from today. Because in the 90s, you know, Klaus or Mečiar, who I haven't brought up, who was the Slovak leader who was preventing Slovakia from being considered in the first round of NATO enlargement and almost prevented it from being in the first round for the EU, understood that there was a consequence. Now, populist leaders see that there may be a domestic political dividend from taking certain approaches, but globally, not so much. Globally, the EU has been ineffective of trying to penalize countries that violate, or governments that violate, these norms and institutional obligations. So I think that's one thing. Global institutions are very ineffective in responding to it, but also markets have been haven't punished these leaders either. There's an interesting article by Johnson and Barnes talking about how strange it is that there was all of this economic nationalism and these punitive banking taxes in Hungary, which did not result in investors pulling out of Hungary. On the contrary, they were able to, when I say nationalize, I guess I want to say not state-wise, but they took the banking sector, which was majority foreign-owned, and they wanted it to be owned by national entrepreneurs, national business people, Hungarians. And so they had this punitive tax on foreigners, but did foreigners then, you know, have this massive flight out of Hungary? Not at all. In fact, if you look at some of the interesting work on the banking sector by Rachel Epstein, she talks about during the financial crisis, actually they stuck it out quite a bit in Eastern Europe and kept their holdings and remained very present in the banking sector in Eastern Europe. So the interesting thing is you have different kinds of populist leaders getting away with it, either in an organized institutional way or also in a disorganized way with the financial community or investors that don't seem to care or don't seem to really focus very much on it. Whereas in the beginning, these liberal economic policies were a mechanism to attract foreign investment. And joining the EU is not just a marker of having transformed your economy, but it was also a means to gain investment and to show that you were open for business. Now, these countries don't face any consequence if they move away from political or economic liberal policies. They don't seem to pay much consequence. So I think that this has mattered. This has mattered. And this contrasts pretty sharply with what happened to Mečiar in the 1990s. So when I think about what is the best example of where the EU really had an impact on this region in promoting liberalism and democracy, it's really in Slovakia, right? Slovakia was in a completely different direction. Vladimir Mečiar was cracking down on the rights of the Hungarian minority. It was, preventing the free media from flourishing. It was not respecting the autonomy of the judicial branch or the president. And in fact, he was punished directly. He was not, he was identified by the European Commission as the reason that they would not have the status of candidacy in the European Union. And in 1998, the electorate responds and votes his group out of office, right? His coalition, I should say. There was a consequence because the EU had some authority to say that there's a consequence for this behavior, but institutions today have nothing like this. And this is something that was a little bit unexpected. Let me move on so we have time for discussion. So how does the war in Ukraine fit in all of this? Maybe there's no talk on Eastern Europe that can't include this piece of it, right? This consideration. Well, all right, so a lot of us have been trying to think about what the war in Ukraine matters for the liberal order, for liberal consensus in Europe, for ideas about the EU and NATO. The invasion, it seemed to me at first, would have resulted in a greater appreciation of multilateral institutions, how fortunate to be in and not out. Certainly, this is no truer anywhere than in NATO, right? The idea that you're in NATO and those security guarantees did ultimately matter significantly for a sense of being protected against, at least for now, revanchism, further aggression by Putin's Russia. But at the same time, it's not that clear to me whether or not this led too much to an appreciation of the European Union. There doesn't seem to really be too much evidence of that. That said, I would say that most of us didn't expect the consensus in Europe, the unity in Europe to be as robust as it was immediately after the war, or to have endured as long as it has. I think a lot of us were nervous about that. So if anything, it has brought Europe together in a way that may not have happened. But the public opinion data do show some greater appreciation from the EU, but I think it's strained, and probably I'm feeling this way all the more after the September 30th elections in Slovakia, and in fact, the re-election of Orbán in April 2022 on the heels of this invasion. So the immediate days after the invasion, Orbán calls Zelensky. He offers his support, and then he backtracks, and he decides that his campaign platform will be based on going it alone with Russia, and that staying out of the war and not supporting Ukraine is its own way to guarantee prosperity and security in Slovakia. So he reverses course very quickly. It's really just a week or so that he shows solidarity with the European Union. And then he's reelected on a campaign that emphasizes that we need to work collaboratively with Russia. That's how we get our good oil, the prices that we have negotiated just 3 weeks earlier. And this is how we enhance our own security, is by breaking with the European Union. Poland, of course, is a different story. Poland has been extraordinarily supportive of the war in Ukraine and has remained consistently anti-Russian from the beginning of peace. And in fact, maybe even especially strong, given Kaczynski or Jarosław Kaczynski's ideas about how Lech Kaczynski, the former president, and other Polish elites died in a plane crash, which he has consistently attributed to intentional policy of Russia. So I don't know that the war, we do see public opinion polls showing greater appreciation for the EU, greater appreciation for NATO, but it hasn't really made a difference in the electoral processes the way one might have hoped it would, which is that if you're going to be embracing Russia as Fico and Smear just did in this last election, that there would be a cost to it. But it doesn't seem to override pocketbook issues or frustrations with the governing elite in Slovakia. It doesn't seem to have this impact in Hungary as well. And we'll, again, see how things turn out in Poland in the elections this weekend. All right, so just a couple of concluding thoughts before I open it up for discussion, because I really do look forward to any kinds of thoughts you have about how I've been laying this out, because the project's under review. It's not done, just in the review stage, but it'd be really great to have feedback from this audience. So my concluding thoughts, well, NATO enlargement and EU accession could have been handled better. So it's not to say that we got everything right, that the West was so insightful about how this should be carried out, not at all. It didn't need to be as fast as it was. It didn't need to be as difficult socially as it was. I think there was a lot of indifference to the economic pain associated with the reforms. Membership conditionality did not leave much space for democratic input. Lending conditionality by the IMF also did not allow much room for softening the sort of harsh consequences. A lot of reforms that, whether they needed to be done or not, absolutely created enormous pain for the populations. And so clearly we could have seen EU enlargement in a way that was a little bit more understanding of the pain that it caused for different groups in the population. And maybe we did not need to do this as quickly or as rigidly as we did. I mean, I'll give you an example. So I wrote, my second book was on tax policy. And the negotiations, this was something I really found fascinating. I did field work in Brussels and in the 5 countries that I looked at. And the kinds of things that the East European candidate countries were trying to negotiate for recognizing the concerns and interests of very small domestic constituencies were absolutely blown out of the water. So I mentioned these big cases of language rights or Polish land, but I remember there were these big debates on excise taxes over things like slivovitz, like plum brandy. They would have to fight forever just to be able to allow different kinds of homemade brandy not to be taxed at this level, or children's clothing. They wanted them to tax it at 0%. The East European governments wanted to continue that process. But Brussels said, absolutely not. There's a minimum VAT tax rate, and you have to impose it, or you don't join the EU. And they could do this over every single area. So I went deep into tax policy, but you could go through the 31 different chapters and see that the East Europeans just had to take it. Probably this was exaggerated, did not need to happen in this way, and more time could have been spent allowing for different groups to adjust to a new reality, a new economic reality. But I think the damaging effects on certain groups in society were underappreciated, both by the EU and other international institutions. The last thing I wanted to say was that a lot of enthusiasm emerged about where we were at the end of the 90s, the early 2000s with enlargement. There was this idea that these countries, by virtue of becoming members of the European Union and NATO, somehow had solved their problems of liberalization, right? Of becoming, reliable members of a liberal order based on the rule of law, free markets, and so on. That somehow we solved it. And I know I felt that way as someone who did work in Central Europe, because they even said, the State Department doesn't need to fund any more research in this area because that's solved. What's interesting and what that reflects is this idea that there would be a lock-in effect, as Annie Moravcik called it, that once you're in these institutions, that somehow the decisions of the leaders who were making those decisions would bind or constrain future leaders down the road, who could then not violate these obligations as set out by these institutions. And that just turned out not to be true. So even if accession turned out, in my mind, to be extremely important for helping governments that were committed to democracy, free markets, and so on, advance their cause politically, despite a fair amount of resistance in different pockets of society, it did not actually do much to lock in those effects in the long run. And that's what we're dealing with today. I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to your comments.
Okay, can you hear me okay? I'm Kathryn Stoner, and as Anna mentioned, this is a joint project between the Europe Center and the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. So I'm the director of that center, and Crease and Hoover, right, all of our funders. So the division of labor is that I will field the questions for you, Hilary.
Thank you.
And apparently here upstairs, CDDRL, they only go to 1 o'clock. So we could riot, we could revolt and go longer, but not past 1:15. Okay, so I see you, Amikai, and I see Larry. 1 second. And as I artfully make this list, I'm going to talk at the same time and say, since I have the microphone. So Hilary, I think it's super interesting and really needed to see whether these accession processes were to blame. I have lots of questions, but one I'll ask, because as you know, I am a Russia specialist, and so Russia is on my mind. I like Russia, even though they don't like me, evidently.
Right.
Won't let me go anymore. There's also, you're talking about the pull factor of the EU in making these sort of lock-in changes, even if not as great changes as we'd hoped. But there's also a pull factor from the East, right, in some of these countries, not Poland so much, although that's kind of pushing Poland perhaps toward the EU and maybe, well, toward NATO, maybe toward the EU, we'll see, I guess. So it may stop the drift toward populist illiberalism in Poland, maybe, we'll see. But it certainly, you know, Russia has certainly pushed or pulled, that is Slovakia, definitely Hungary, and maybe the Czech Republic away, right? This has been a stated policy of Putin's to try and break up the European Union, and so tends to, you know, has targeted certain countries. So what about that? The pull factor demonstration effect as well from the East. Okay, and I'll continue the list, just try to meet my eyes. And
All right. So the appeal of Russia, of course, is a piece of this story that is almost shocking the first time we see it, right? The first time you start to see Orban profess his appreciation for both Vladimir Putin, but the model, the illiberal model of Russia, and you know, he mentions China, Turkey, this famous speech that he makes, is kind of surprising. And in truth, we didn't think of so much the appeal of Russia being very significant in this region, when if anything, in the very early 90s, you see the presidents of these countries already trying to get into NATO, clamoring in May 1992 to already join NATO because they're afraid of Russia. There is a lingering fear of Russia in terms of their own security. So it is surprising when it emerges. And I think what's not anticipated is that it's not so much the appeal of the illiberal model, but the ability to channel resources toward leaders who then have a way to use those resources to be more effective in their electoral strategies. So to me, what I find particularly worrisome or important is not the kind of global appeal of that model as much as the recognition by the Kremlin that channeling funds to parties that will do its bidding is quite effective, as you know, influencing the blogosphere and the debates in social media and all the things, disinformation campaigns turn out to be more effective than they might have been. But I don't think it's so much the pull on a normative level. And when I presented this work, pull away from the European Union, right? And to fund those kinds of Eurosceptic politicians that then undermine the ability of Brussels to advance a kind of united front against not just Russia, but also China on competition policy, all sorts of ways in which those kinds of fractures in society can be exploited through resources, right? So I think it does matter. And I think that's something that was not appreciated, and it's going to remain a problem.
let's try a lightning round because I saw a lot of hands. I have Amikai, then Larry, Alan behind me, Aisha, Jim, Marcel, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name at the table. Yes.
Volia.
Well, yeah, okay. All right, so Amikai.
Yeah. Very good to hear. I'll just confine myself to comments that might be helpful for the project.
Thank you.
One, the role of Silvio Berlusconi. If there was a prototype of anti-EU populism in the 1990s, it was Silvio Berlusconi, and so don't forget him. Two, the role of the OECD. Why do we see this variation? Slovakia, Hungary, Estonia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Latvia, they're all members of the OECD. The conditionality of the OECD is, if anything, broader and more intrusive into every nook and cranny of public policy, even more so than the 8,000 pages of the Acquis Communautaire. Why do we not see the OECD be a target of this type of pushback? I think Ivan Krastev, there's a lot in what he says. I would describe this as luxury populism. So you get to play a cynical game of political entrepreneurship, stoking nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Soros sentiments, while at the same time essentially enjoying the largesse of the EU, the security that NATO provides you, and there's no cost, right? So why not do it? Last thing, I just want to remind, I know we're short on time. I think your case is even stronger than you present, in the sense that conditionality, even at the time, was arguably seen to be too weak rather than too strong. Leonardo Molino and I wrote a book about the problem of decoupling at the time. So there was a lot of sort of formal conditionality, but actually the EU turned a blind eye to kind of very shallow internalization or no internalization. Everybody focused on Romania and Bulgaria at the time as the sort of the bad boys of the process. And there was a little bit more stringent conditionality. But the real failure is post-accession conditionality. Like once these countries were in, there was like zero leverage. And that's the real failure.
Okay, before you answer that, let's bring in Larry, and then we'll come back to you. Sorry.
So thank you for this excellent presentation. And I agree, your case is even stronger. So three quick points. One, in response to that is, I think the argument that you were persuasively rebutting is very decontextualized from what's going on in the rest of the world. If a lot of countries around the world around the same time are drifting in the same illiberal populist direction or worse, and they didn't have EU succession and they didn't have NATO enlargement, the argument is already suspect, and it doesn't stand up, I think, to even the superficial pondering of the counterfactual of what would have happened in these countries like Poland and Hungary if they hadn't been admitted to the EU and so on. The second point is that the first point I made is true, the global trend, because a lot of other things that were going on globally in this period in terms of changing zeitgeist in the world, the changing willingness and ability of democracies generally, not just the EU, to stand up to and exert counter pressure, exert costs on these illiberal drifts. And in that regard, I think you should address the institutional problems in the EU in at least two respects that people have written about. One is the requirement for consensus among members to really impose costs and even to suspend a member. And then that becomes impossible once Poland does the same thing that Hungary started doing. And the second thing is the structure of the EU party system in the parliament that led a lot of conservative ruled countries not to pull the trigger on sanctioning Hungary. And just briefly, the third point, I really think we just have to stop calling Hungary a democracy. I feel this very passionately. It's not just the grotesque gerrymandering of the parliamentary districts, which makes what has happened in the US look mild by comparison, and the other manipulation of the rules. it's just, you live in an atmosphere in Hungary where the media domination by Orban and his party and his cronies, it just suffuses the atmosphere. And if you don't have a minimally level electoral playing field, you know, everything else can be nice on election day, but it's still not an electoral democracy. I think Poland is probably still, I defer to Anna, on the other side of still at least an electoral democracy for now. But I think Hungary ceased to be an electoral democracy some time ago.
Okay, let's go back to you, Hilary, and then Alan and Aisha on deck.
All right, well, thank you for the feedback and the thoughts. Berlusconi is a very interesting example. You're right. He is someone like Klaus already is using this kind of Euro bashing, and it works. And he's, you know, I remember when people were so surprised around me, including me, that Trump was elected, I kept thinking, but this is happening in so many places around the world. Why are we so different in this country that we're not susceptible to the same kind of tricks? And Berlusconi was at the forefront of my mind on that. So I think it's a good point, and that would take me outside of what I was looking at, but it is an excellent example of a model of leadership that figured out certain tricks that are then, in a sense, emulated shortly thereafter by West European and East European leaders. I don't have any insight into why the OECD is not been attacked, but I would welcome your insight that it hasn't been, and that there might be something to look into there. I don't know. The argument that both you and Larry are making about conditionality being too weak, or that, you know, we think of it as so invasive and so intrusive, but in fact it was very cosmetic. It's a point that certainly can be made over many different examples and areas. So I get that point, and it's not that I would disagree with it, because I can think of so many examples, and I've listed them in my own work in different capacities to try to argue that. So I'm aware of them. But at the same time, I think that, you know, the 80,000 pages of laws, and in fact, it was closer to 100,000 of laws, and just how large the EU bureaucracy became in the Commission to go through every single policy area and every kind of institution. And the fact that in 9 of the chapters, there was not a single exception made for all 10 countries. Again, little things like how you tax diapers, how you, I mean, these were all very, very small. And the examples in those chapters that were sort of, you know, people threw up their hands, they were only transitional periods that were granted. They really did require harmonization across so many areas. So, I mean, maybe it's a matter of, you know, emphasizing the exceptions, but I think if we look at the forest from the trees, these countries abandoned, you know, administrative planning and centralized control over their economies for these markets that were absolutely required in so many different capacities. We can look at, you know, all the ways in which they adopted different kinds of political changes. And I think I would still probably on balance come down with saying that the EU had a major impact in small and large ways in transforming these countries. And Slovakia is probably the biggest example of a real complete, you know, turn that you know, happened. But I think the leadership who supported this had something that was true and credible, that they had to do these things regardless of what the population thought, or else you couldn't move ahead for something that everyone agreed was a priority. So again, it's not that I couldn't come up with a lot of examples, and I've struggled with them. I have a recent paper, it's 2023, looking at minority rights in how this was really downplayed relative to sort of market reforms required by the Commission. So there are areas where I've looked at it and I've come up with the same conclusion. But if I step back and I look at the big picture, I think the EU is extraordinarily powerful. And if you look at Malala Anna-Vahutova's work, you know, she will characterize it in this way, and in the, maybe not in this paper, but I have used sort of her general characterizations as someone who steps back and says, never have we ever seen countries give up this much policy-making authority, as in the case of the East European candidate countries hoping to join the EU. So again, it's a characterization, but I don't disagree with you. There are many examples.
Okay, so we'll go back to another lightning round. Maybe this time I'll try and bring in 3. Alan, who's sitting behind me.
Okay, hi. I learned a lot from the talk. Thanks very much. 2 questions, actual questions. number one, what kinds of institutional reforms do you think might produce different behavior on the part of recalcitrant countries, other than, making it easier to evict them or suspend them? I mean, there have been fines, as you mentioned, on budget. The court itself has also issued fines, independently of consensus in the commission on Poland in particular, right? So we've seen financial sanctions. So I'm wondering what else, is there anything short of suspension that you think would do the trick? And secondly, just thinking about Brexit, which is interesting because it's a case that involves Euroscepticism, but maybe not illiberalism in the same way. And again, it also, like Berlusconi, takes you outside your comfort zone, but I'm wondering if it teaches us anything about whether there's a Eurosceptical problem, which is separate from the broader global rise of illiberalism. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Aisha.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Yeah, my question is about this EU accession process. I mean, the one example that comes to mind is, of course, Turkey, which I study, but it go through many of these accession processes. It closed many chapters, but at the end, Turkey couldn't become a member. But we see the similar rise of populism, authoritarianism in Turkey. So how does it play into your explanation? I mean, it seems to support it, but do you think of in other ways? I mean, it seems like in both sides of this accession process, there's this rise of populism. So,
All right, and so
and just one more question.
Okay, just
You allude to the immigration as an alternative explanation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about it.
okay, before you answer that, actually, can you pass it back? Because I was just told that the microphones will pick you up, the mics on the table, and I don't need to share this. All right, Jim, old guy.
Oh, great, thanks. Thanks so much for the talk. And I was curious, you mentioned rightly the consensus in NATO and the EU since February 24th of 2022 in being able to respond forcefully to the Russian expanded invasion. And I was just curious how you explain that. I mean, I worried a lot in those early months that there were countries in the EU and NATO, I mean, Hungary being in both, that would gum up the works and would make it more difficult for these consensus organizations to have a forceful response. And yet, despite the illiberals in the organizations, both of them have responded incredibly well to what's happened since February 2022.
I'm sorry, in that last part of the question, who's the they in that?
Well, I mean, how do you explain the consensus, even with these illiberal states, that both NATO and the EU have been able to act? I mean, you've got Viktor Orban, pro-Russian, and yet NATO and the EU have been able to act incredibly strongly, despite some of these characters, Turkey as well, in the institution.
Why don't we let you answer those, and if we have time, we'll go back to Marcel, Woya, and Cornelia.
All right, well, so Alan's question, like, what would it take to have an impact on these countries? I wish I knew the answer to that, right? Because in reality, they have tried some things that should have mattered. And I think without the war in Ukraine, maybe it would have kicked in Poland, right? At some point, these countries, the reason I don't think there's any real threat of a Brexit or a leave campaign is because they are still able to be, net recipients of budgets that matter quite a bit for these countries. And if that would change, that might matter in a way that could change calculations for people, because the people know, and the leadership knows too, that they benefit in a very clear material way from EU membership. So they can complain as much as they want. I just think, given what Poland has done, for example, with, so strongly supporting the war in Ukraine, taking in all these refugees, being a transit for weapons, all of that seemed to justify putting illiberalism on the back burner. So, again, I don't know that anyone right now is still going to make the calculation that it would be better to punish Poland for the sake of democratic reform. I think it's almost a luxury that doesn't exist right now for the EU either, because Poland is such a key player in supporting Ukraine in ways that other countries can't necessarily do. So again, absent of the war, it would be these things, I think, affect the bottom line. That's what I would have said. They would have had to really penalize them in terms of the budget, in terms of COVID relief funds. They did freeze those funds, but I think there's a point at which it would have mattered more. I think that euro fine a day, when did that start? It was just a few months prior to the war. So by then, it just didn't have the time to, yeah, that sounds about right, November to February. So I just don't think that enough time had passed where they really could have paid the price in the most material sense. But given the current conditions, I don't see it. Hungary, it is a little bit confusing to me why there hasn't been more reaction to it. Maybe for the sake of keeping the overall consensus so large, because Hungary could go further. It is really not violated in very significant ways the project of defending Ukraine. And I think that the requirement of unanimity is part of the reason why they're playing it very carefully. But I think that we're just, again, it's the same answer really, which is that the geopolitical context doesn't really create a very suitable environment for cracking down in meaningful ways. So why has the consensus lasted this long? I think because, we're here in California and we're pretty far away from this war, but I do think that it feels very close in Europe. And, those of you, I'm sure many of you have traveled in Europe since the war, and the presence of the refugees is quite palpable everywhere. I don't think people are forgetting about it for very long. So that probably contributes to the fact that there has been a consensus. Also, I think that some of the costs that everyone was very worried about in terms of energy security turned out to be less acute than expected. So some of the things that were expected to undermine the consensus didn't emerge for all sorts of reasons. Some of them based on the weather, and some of them based on an ability to maneuver more quickly than anyone expected. So, it's really, I hope it's sustained, but then, we'll see when do you have a critical mass of populist leaders? How many more will it take before it starts to break down? I think we have to watch it very carefully because there are more cases being added. And so that is disconcerting. Turkey. So yeah, Turkey is, wow, if there's ever a country right now that seems to have been able to play this war to its advantage in terms of its geopolitical significance, it's got to be Turkey. But in terms of the EU, it's also been an important player. So it didn't get what it was trying to achieve with membership since '87. I mean, it's been a lot of years of trying to adopt the reforms to get in and still not getting anywhere in this process. And, there's a lot of perspectives as to why this is, some of them based on culture and religion, and other things based on just the size of the country and the level of GDP and what it would mean for reversing who's a net contributor and a net recipient. And there's all sorts of things that play into this story. But, why does Turkey how does it fit into the story? I guess I think that Turkey has been able to be a very interesting player as somebody as a country that's in NATO, that is still trying to be able to be in NATO, but yet mediate in ways with Russia that are kind of unexpected. It almost defies logic how that's even possible. When you see other non-NATO members do this, in the BRICS countries, for example, they're all trying to be mediators and, give the sense of being neutral and being a player in this diplomatic arena. They haven't had to do that with the obligations of NATO membership. So I'm almost just agreeing with you that it's very hard for me to even be able to explain its tremendous skill of Erdogan of somehow or another having that leverage, that maneuverability. So I guess I can only agree with the inspiration of the question is that it's very hard to understand. On the immigration front, immigration has been something also really hard to understand because it was so important in mobilizing opposition to governments in 2015. And I keep thinking it's going to become more important any day now in Europe with the presence of Ukrainian refugees. It just, again, the demographics are different. That's part of it. Women and children tend to be a different kind of threat. They still are seen as a threat for different reasons. But I think what's surprising is not that people were reacting so strongly, sadly, to the presence of millions of migrants in the mid-teens. It's more the willingness to absorb the Ukrainian migrants to this degree is pretty extraordinary.
All right, so let's see.
If we can hit these last three questions in a last lightning round and in a compromise situation by 109, 110. Okay, so Marcel, Papchamp, Volya, and Cornelia.
I just wanted to say that many of the themes that you raised could be housed under the concept of free riding. So all the rules, the EU rules, are basically to avoid that countries then free ride, basically by taking all the advantage of the access to the market and free movements of goods and people, but then at the same time have local laws that benefit their firms or their people. So that's the reason why you have, and that's still there. So there's not been free riding because it's not possible. Once you've joined, you have to adopt these laws, and they are courts and so on. They will enforce that, but they didn't introduce that concept for democracy. So then there is no similar, so they can free ride as one of your sources was saying. And then that raises the issue of if liberal democracy is not a resting state, there's a lock-in effect that you talked about. Then we need to have when we create this organization, whether OECD, NATO, EU, and all that, must be some rules that are practical for suspension, exclusion, sanctions, and so on. And then it looks like the EU in particular did all the rules up front, and then after that doesn't have sufficient bite in the second.
Okay.
That's something to think about for future organization.
Okay, very quickly, Volya and Cornelia.
Great. So thanks so much for an interesting talk. I fully agree with your main thesis, which is expressed kind of like in the negative. Like it's what we're seeing currently with the rise of populism in Eastern Europe is not because of the consequences of EU accession, NATO accession, and so on. And I've heard like several different reasons also in this discussion, which includes there's a rise of populism elsewhere, and the EU NATO accession, and the main painful reforms that had to be implemented were like actually taking place in early 2000s rather than later on when we see this populist backlash. But I think one thing that I still kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about, and that to me didn't come quite as clearly in the talk, is like, why are these countries electing populists? It doesn't sound like this populists are campaigning on anti-EU platforms necessarily. A lot of it is about domestic, pension reform, etc. And is the populist type variety in Eastern Europe different from populist type variety that we're seeing in Western Europe? And maybe because of this conditionality or the EU or the relatively recent history of democracy in these places, these populists are different from Western European populists.
Populism. Okay. And Cornelia, last one.
Just very quickly, I'm an academic guest. I'm working for the Swiss government, and I've also been in the talks with the EU on freedom of person in the EU. And I just wanted to back your argument that the accession process was invasive and it had an effect on public opinion. That's exactly what. And we also have a populist party about from these disputes, and there is a leverage. Look at those countries who have signed up to agreements. We have the Schengen Agreement, a bilateral agreement that we are a member of the Schengen space, and there is a guillotine clause, the guillotine, which says then if we do not dynamically adapt to every new Schengen law, then we will be kicked out. And that's why so Switzerland, who is a direct democracy, we can't vote on Schengen because of that. So that's it.
All right. Over to you.
Yeah, well, I like it when the last question says, yes, you want to agree and augment my argument. I think that's a great way to end. And also, I appreciate that so much. It's funny, this is to Volya's question. I was given a task, figure out whether we messed up in the 1990s in this part of the world that you've been now told to look at. And so I felt like, okay, my job now is to really spend some time thinking about a period that I spent a lot of time in the region, doing field work. And actually, I was kind of delighted to be asked, right? But then when you actually come up with the answer, which is, I don't think this is the answer, that doesn't make for a very satisfying read. Like so I actually totally get why you're saying, well, then tell me what it really is. So I've gone through a couple of rounds of comments where they want to know, well, then tell me what it is. So I'm like, well, that's another paper. Or another, major project here at Stanford, right? I'm trying to explain populism. So I have no choice but to provide something in the paper and a little bit here, because it would be very satisfying to say, I'm going to raise a possibility and then tell you it's not that. Okay, so I do then look to colleagues who work on populism in a very rigorous way and try to think about what they, and mostly in this project, tip my like recognize the work of other people who have been trying to provide arguments on this and say, well, this is what some people are saying about the weakness of the political party system. This is what some people are saying about the relevance of electoral law. I don't have an answer. And by the same token, I really don't have a global explanation for populism, in part because it is such a big thing to then address. Maybe the best I could do in sort of the next iteration of this, which at some point will come, is to try to think if there is anything distinctive about populism, as I was asked, in East European populism versus populism in other places, because there are so many examples. And I actually find that not easier, but at least a more feasible thing to try to untangle, because explaining populism in these few countries is a whole lot easier than now explaining Duterte. And now, it's just too much. It's too much. So I don't know how to explain Brazilian populism and explain, Russian populism and Turkish populism, and, Philippines, there's too many leaders and too many distinct trajectories for me to try to generalize in a casual way. I think it would take a very serious multi-person research project, and that would be its own project. But I recognize this dissatisfaction. I should have done you and then ended with the Switzerland. But I recognize the concern, because if someone is telling you, well, it's not this, despite the reality that there's some overlap in rhetoric and language and reasons, and you still want to know what it is. And that I really can't do justice to it in this project. But I've been looking at those who do try to take this on head on, cite those people, refer to those explanations, and leave it at that.
Well, thank you. Seldom do we have such an honest and sort of truthful ending to a seminar as that, and it just, I think that's what a wonderful academic you are. You know what you can say, and you know what you can't say, which we should all adhere to. All right. Well, thank you so much, Hilary, and thank you all for your good questions.